Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. You're with Cameron Murray, and today the most requested guest for the podcast, Professor Steve Keen, dialing in all the way from London. Steve, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Cameron, and great to see you again. As we were saying before we started, about a dozen years since we've seen each other, I would say.
Yeah. For people who don't know, I've known Steve a while. I think we were in the blogosphere during the financial crisis, saying, "Hey, there's something wrong. There's a bubble here." And of course, you're one of the few to point that out. And your book, Debunking Economics, was part of my formative training to really take economics, how do I put it, seriously, but cautiously and
Yeah,
critically rather than uncritically and just, eating it all up. So thank you for that, Steve.
you're welcome. That's why I wrote it. Because I went through the whole slog of learning why all this stuff was garbage back when I was 18. That's when I began reading it, and I'm 73 now. 73 this month, and I just knew that the reason to write the book was I was actually thinking more of activists than I was of other potential academic economists, but I thought there was so many times when somebody's got some social campaign they're working on, they'll go to a government committee and they'll get rolled by the economists there saying, "Oh no, we should leave it to the market," and they don't know how to fight back. And I said, "Look, he thinks he knows his stuff. He doesn't. When you look deep in the foundations, everything in neoliberal economics, neoclassical economics is false." So here's how to shoot him down and hit him back with some papers he's never read before that undermine his ideas.
So maybe we should start there with you were a very active student at the University of Sydney many decades ago, from what I
hmm
understand. Were there sort of pivotal moments for you that made you question what was being taught? Was there a paper, a speech, an experience that really triggered this critical thinking and led you to dig deeper?
Good questions.
Yeah.
The context, I think, is the most important thing because 1971, that's towards the end of the Vietnam War, and young people these days don't know what it's like to be told as you're leaving school that you've got to register for for the draft, and if your number comes up, you've got to go and spend up to 2 years fighting in Vietnam. When I got to university in 1971, that was still when we had the Conservative government, the so-called Liberal Party, in charge, and they then had Whitlam's Labor Party campaigning to abolish the war. But at the time, 71, I was 18, and I just was believed in fighting against communism. At that stage, I was still quite conservative. And the only thing that I found weird was that they were going to conscript me to fight for freedom.
You had no
Something
freedom to choose to fight. You were, yeah.
Yeah, something did got compute. So, and this is students these days are incredibly shortchanged compared to the experience that I had. Probably the halcyon period of universities was before free education came in with Gough Whitlam, but it was still I got a scholarship. I didn't have any fees to pay, and you you had about say 20 hours a week of lectures I was doing, and you had the time after that was your own. You didn't have the massive assignments students do these days. You tended to have one essay and one exam in every subject. So that gave you more free time in a crazy sort
Mm.
of way. And so I was studying, reading all I could about Vietnam, and I finally realized. First of all, I wasn't a conscientious objector. The way they set up the test essay was basically if you're watching your mother and your sister's getting raped, the conscientious objector would not go in and defend them. Well, screw that for a joke.
Mhm.
That's a ludicrous definition of conscientious objection, and I would definitely have gone in there. But I also thought, what about my definition? Would I fight in this war? And I finally realized, yes, I would fight in this war, but on the side of the Viet Cong. Because when you looked at it, it was a colonial war. It had nothing to do with fighting communism. The origins of the war were that France occupied Vietnam. There's a colonial power in Vietnam. Then and you had an anti-colonial movement at the time. And then when the Japanese invaded, the anti-colonial movement agreed with the French to fight the Japanese on the condition that they would then decolonized after the war? Well, the French reneged, and then the Viet Cong fought them to a standstill in the Battle of I think it was Dien Bien Phu. I've forgotten some of the old names, but a major battle that the French lost. And then the Americans moved in. No, and
Sounds.
that's the Vietnamese call it the American War. Okay, that had nothing to do with if, with them. And
Mm.
I realized it was basically an anti-colonial movement, and if I communist, yes, but fundamentally anti-colonial, and so that's what I supported. So there was no way I was going to you know, I was a draft resistor when it came to the final push. I did not register for the draft, though I could have got an exemption because I was a university student. So that was the sort of milieu, and at the same time, it was full employment, and I mean genuinely full employment. So the unemployment rate was about 1%. And so
Oh wow.
literally anybody who didn't have a job really was frictional on them, but he was, between jobs. You had a feeling that it didn't matter what you did at university, you'd still get a job at the end of it, which meant you didn't feel intimidated about standing out and taking political stances on campus. So that was the milieu, and all the energy of the student movement was fighting the Vietnam War. Now you then had in so that's the background in 71. So I'm reading all this stuff. I'm also, a firm believer in neoclassical economics. I wrote a student paper at one stage. I'm thankfully as nobody can find it, where I argued in favor of abolishing both trade unions and monopolies, which is the typical, the
Mm.
neoclassical thing tells you the best possible situation is competitive workers facing competitive firms. No,
Mm.
and monopolies are bad. You want perfect competition. So
Mm.
I swallowed the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. And particularly that whole issue over wage setting. The argument was you get the best possible outcome if there's no monopoly on either the workers' side or the management side. So therefore, in that situation, the wage becomes the marginal product of labour, and that's meritocratic. That's the sort of thing that lies in the theory.
So,
Anyway, so I swallowed.
so you
Yeah.
would you would say neoclassical economists, you're sort of um, defining that as like the typical way most people who get their introductory economics in first
Oh
year,
yeah.
perfect competition, everything clears, we're all informed. Oh, there's other intricacies that we'll study later, but
Yeah.
most people who've studied economics get the cleanest sort of neoclassical view and never really get to that. Is that sort of what you're saying is the
Yeah. Very much
neoclassical
so.
view? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we began our first year with indifference curves and Slutsky equations, all the stuff that now students don't get till they get to second year or stuff like that. But it was before the crazy dynamic stochastic general equilibrium nonsense came in as well. And in some cases, you feel like you're doing a course in set theory rather than a course in economics and modern today. But at that time, we got an intense version of Samuelsonian economics, but that's what it actually is. All those indifference curves and stuff is bugger all to do with Keynes. It's all work from Edgeworth in the 19th century and Samuelson in the 20th century.
And to be clear, you're saying that this was all this sort of perfectly informed microeconomics
Yep.
theory. And what economics sort of did was package that up and say, well, macroeconomics is actually just this, but there's a representative consumer who's everybody, and there's a
That that
representative seller. And
that came
yeah,
later. That came
okay.
later, because at the time that I was going through, you didn't have the so-called rational expectations revolution having
Oh,
taken over. That began with a paper by John Muth, um, called I think Rational Expectations and the Theory of Price Movements or something of that nature. But it hadn't infected macro
uh-huh,
at that stage as fully as it did later. Um,
uh-huh.
but anyway, what you got was a vision like it's Marshallian, basically. Supply and demand curve. Supply demand curve for labour was the marginal product of labour. Supply curve was effectively the marginal disutility of work. If if you have a monopoly, seller, then you're going to get a higher price, higher wages, but lower demand, etc., etc. And you abolish both of them, and you're in a better situation. That was I got that in first semester, first term. But back in those days, it was the three-term system. That was the first 9 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then we got a guy called Frank Stillwell. You know Frank, don't you?
I know of him, yeah, and I've read
You
some
should
of
meet
his
him,
stuff.
mate.
Okay.
he's alive and kicking. He's older, about
Ah,
10 years older than me, but
ah,
he's a fabulous guy. Anyway, so he turned up. I've forgotten which university he was from in England. He was probably 28 when I was 18, and he had started to see through the mainstream theory. So he's a brilliant lecturer, a really, really great lecturer, and he gave us a lecture on what's called the theory of the second best. Ever heard of that?
yeah.
Okay, so normally you
But
don't
you,
learn that.
yeah, you better
You know,
explain it to the listeners though, quickly.
yeah, okay, okay. It's something. It's a wrinkle in the theory, which says the theory basically says perfect competition is absolutely the best situation. So and therefore that means both in the labour market and the the goods market, you want to have competitive firms bidding against other competitive firms to hire workers, and workers bidding against each other, and so on. So you get the perfect supply and demand outcome, and therefore equilibrium. That's your best possible situation. Well, but then if you have if you think in terms of the standard theory of product markets, they teach you that if you have a monopoly will price where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But for the case of a monopoly, that marginal revenue is below the price.
Mm,
Whereas if you have a competitive market, marginal revenue equals price. This is part of the jargon of the theory, and
yep.
what it means is that you're told that if you have a monopoly, you're going to get a higher price and a lower quantity. uh, So that's the argument against the monopoly. Now, what Frank gave us was the theory of the second best in the context of where there was both a monopoly seller of labour, so that's the unions, but a monopoly buyer of labour on the other side, effectively, employer associations. And he showed, using the theory of the second best, that if you move one step closer to nirvana, so your nirvana is competitive
Mm,
workers and competitive firms, move one step closer, but not two. So you either abolish the union or you abolish the employers association. You make social welfare worse.
mm,
Now, I remember, I even know where I was sitting at the time. This is the Merriweather Lecture Theatre 1. I was on the left-hand side of the hall, about two-thirds of the way up towards the back. And I just, what? Because here is this bringing in a bit of reality. So you know there are both trade unions and employer associations. You bring in the reality, and it inverts what you were told when you start from the so-called perfect situation. So if you're one step from perfection, then yes, get rid of that section, that wrinkle. You get rid of the trade union. You have competitive firms facing a trade
yeah.
union. Get rid of the trade union. You'll make welfare better for everybody. But if you have competitive unions and worker associations, and you abolish one but not the other, you make the situation provably worse in terms of
Mm,
welfare economics. And I remember just being in shock. And then I thought, is this in my textbook? So I flicked through the textbook, no mention of it at all. And I just walked out of that lecture absolutely stunned and thought, my textbook's not telling me this, but I've now, had this proven to me by my lecturer. So I went down to the university library. There was the Merriweather building had its own economics library at the time, and I got that paper, the one by it was Lancaster. I've forgotten the other author of the theory of the second best, but I read it. At that stage, I was doing mathematics at the same time, not like I'm doing an arts degree rather than an
yeah.
economics degree. So I was doing economics, mathematics, and psychology and legal history in my first year. So I was being taught calculus and algebra by top class mathematicians, and it was a breeze for me to read that paper back then. I've probably struggled with it now because I haven't worked in that field for decades, but it was easy to read, and I thought, yes, it's incontrovertible, makes absolute sense. Why the fuck am I not being taught it?
Mm,
So that made me very skeptical of the textbooks. And then I thought, I wonder what's in the journals. Is this stuff turning up in the journals? And I then happened to get a copy, I think, of the 1965 or 66 edition of the Economic Journal. And there I found a Marxist being published, a guy called Baduri. And that
mhm.
gave me a shock. What's a Marxist being published in the Economic Journal? But the real killer was I found a paper by Paul Samuelson called a summing up. And that was summing up his reaction to a debate that I hadn't heard a damn thing about, which is called the Cambridge controversies. Have you
Oh,
heard of
yeah.
those?
Yeah, the Cambridge
Okay.
capital controversy. So this is about
Yeah.
the returns to capital investment, right? And the
Yeah. Well,
lumpiness
it's
of
about how do you
capital.
measure capital? Because
Yeah.
and this is a perennial confusion in economics, And this was a debate over that confusion because economists quite happily mix up physical capital and monetary capital. They talk as if you can treat physical capital like it's the same thing as money. You can just move it
Yeah.
anywhere you like. You can take it from one industry to another. Now, that to me, that's a foundation myth of neoclassical economics, and I wasn't aware of the myth. And if you go through a conventional education, it just seems natural to talk in terms of capital rather than talking in terms of physical machinery being different
Mm.
to money. And of course,
Mm.
it's easier to move money from one industry to another. It's not possible to move machinery from one industry to another.
Yeah.
So they gloss over that. So this dispute was a question of how do you measure the amount of capital? Because if you measure labor and man hours, how many hours people put
Hmm.
in work, and you measure their pay in dollars. So you get dollars per man hour, and there's no necessary. That's quite a sensible combination. You can work out the wage per person that way. How do you measure the rate of profit? Well, the rate of profit is supposed to be the profit divided by capital. How do you measure capital? Well, the amount of capital you measure you have
Mm.
depends upon the rate of profit. So you get a
Yeah, that's right.
circularity. Okay. So this brilliant Cambridge, UK economist Piero Sraffa said we have to work out a way of measuring capital that's independent of the rate of return on capital initially. So what he did was he said we can convert machinery now into the inputs, machinery inputs the previous year, plus the labor that was involved, multiplied by one plus the rate of profit. So each time you take the machines now and you then say the machinery now was machinery the year before with labor to convert it into the new machine, and then you keep on going backwards and backwards. And you finally got a relationship that gave you you measured capital in terms of dated labor. So that became a valid independent way to measure it. But then what it gave you was circularity turned up in the effect of the how you measured it. The rate of profit affected the rate of measurement of capital in a non-linear way. Now, that was a real attack on the basis of economics. And the neoclassicals, of course, pushed back. And Samuelson gave what he thought was a coup de grace in a paper, and I think in 65. And in that paper, he said, look, we teach this idea about flexible capital labor ratios as a parable to our students. He literally called it a parable. We know that in the real world, every particular technology has a fixed relationship of capital to labor. So you can't, vary the number of, you can't have a machine that needs 10 workers and then you suddenly make it a machine that needs 6 workers. It needs
Yeah.
10 workers and that's it. Okay. So he said, what you get, the envelope we draw for the students, or the curve, is the envelope of a whole lot of straight lines. And he thought he'd knocked the argument out of the water. Well, then one of the economists on the other side showed that if given this dated labour concept, they weren't straight lines, they were curves. And they would intersect with each other. And so you have what's called re-switching. And in that
Mm.
case, what it meant was technology you'd use when there was a high rate of profit would then be swapped for another one at a lower rate of profit and swapped back to the first one for a still lower rate of profit. There was no easy way to measure it. Now that
Yeah.
blew Samuelson out of the water, and Samuelson conceded defeat in 1966. I had Samuelson's textbook with me. Did he mention the debate? No.
Ah.
And I thought, I'm being lied to by my
S-
bloody textbooks. So
So
that was
you're
the real
actually
breakaway point
reading
for
all
me.
this stuff. You're reading the
Yep.
debates about the capital controversies, the theory of the second best,
Mm.
and it's not arising in the classroom, but it seems like it's really important. Do you
Yeah.
do you think it's changed? Like when you talk about the second best, I guess I can see more modern economists, and maybe the teaching's not so different in the first years, thinking about, well, there's the monopsony, which we call like the monopoly employer and the monopoly sort
Mhm.
of provider. And we will just talk about relative market power on both sides of the market. And we'll sort of incorporate all that. Do you think we're better at incorporating those
No,
now?
no,
Or,
far fucking worse.
okay.
Pardon the French. Far fucking worse. Because at least back in, like I mentioned, the first copy I grabbed of the Economic Journal had a paper by Baduri, a Marxist, in there. Joan Robertson got published there. All the non-orthodox people criticizing the theory could be expected to be published in some of the mainstream journals. Now, if you try to put anything into a mainstream journal and you're not making mainstream assumptions, you get a desk rejection. Okay,
Yeah.
so the modern mob have no knowledge of their own history. So I've spoken at Cambridge University and debated with a couple of the right wingers there. They don't know they're right wing. They think they're progressive, but they're neoclassical, and that's the only religion they'll allow in the economic church. They don't even know they don't know whether Cambridge used to be the bastion of Cambridge, England, used to be the bastion of the critics. They're not even aware of their own history. So in many ways, it's become dumber. It's more complicated and dumber than it was back in the 50s and 60s. But at least you get a bit of a debate into the fulcrum.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story because I've submitted, lots of papers to lots of journals, and one of them was critiquing about profits and rates of return. And I said, "Oh, isn't this weird?" And it was about basically there's no denominator in profit, right? There's no sort of capital at risk. It's all like
Yeah,
instantaneous. The
they talk in the absolute level of profit rather than the profit rate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, or the rate of return on things, on the capital, on the things that you put together to make a business and put at risk. And
yeah,
I wrote this paper just saying, oh, isn't it interesting how these results differ? And it was quite funny because William Baumol, famous economist, did a similar thing in 1955. And I
yeah.
actually emailed him and he said, yeah, he was like 95 and he replied to me and said,
No, good
um,
on him. Yeah,
he said, "Oh, Cameron, I haven't looked at this for about 40 years. What you're doing sounds like a great exercise." He was very supportive, but obviously he's a 95-year-old
yeah,
guy getting lots of emails.
mm,
And it was so my point being that when the reviewers got it, I had both the critique that this is dumb, this is stupid, why would anyone do this? And
yeah,
a different reviewer, same journal, this is so obvious and embedded in the standard model. What is he trying to say? Like, I'm like, it
yeah.
can't. So, what is it? Do you even know your own theory? So that was
Well, they
like
don't
one
know
of
their
my
own
key
theory.
lessons as well.
Yeah, this is one of the real things that you have to realize as you read the literature. They don't know their own theory. Um, they they
Mm,
live most of them live at the level of the textbook. They don't escape from the textbook and read the journals and see how the ideas were developed. And when you do it, you find that neoclassical theory has contradicted itself at all sorts of fundamental levels. And rather than admitting the contradiction, they say, "Oh, that they get something which is like it's like saying you've got a you're traveling on a road and there's a pothole, where you've maneuvered to avoid the pothole. Um, they don't even know the pothole is there. Okay, they leave it out completely. So like my favorite, there's many I can give an example of. But you know the notion of rational expectations.
yeah, which
Okay,
basically means
okay.
everyone knows the future, so everyone's sort of reverse back from their known future, the right thing to do today. Is that
Yeah,
basically what you
it
mean?
basically presume people can predict the future, which is
Mm.
crazy, and they call it rational. But the intriguing thing is, I've got to find, just looking for a reference here that I can show, because Muth's original paper, if you read it, you find that he actually contradicts neoclassical theory to derive the idea of rational expectations, because if something is valuable and scarce, is it free?
Is it free?
According to neoclassical theory. If something is
No,
valuable and
it's
scarce,
because
is it
someone
free?
else might want it. There's an opportunity cost, an alternative use for someone else, so you can
You've got to
trade
pay
it.
for it.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, you've got to pay for it. Okay, so what Muth, when he justified this, is the paper's called "Rational Expectations and the Theory of Price Movements" in 1961, and he goes through saying expectations, since they are informed predictions of future events, are essentially the same as the predictions of the relevant economic theory. So that's why they
Ah,
feed
so he's
expectation.
basically
So
saying
that's what
everyone knows the right economic theory, so that theory predicts the
everybody knows the
future.
right
So we
model.
all.
Yeah, okay. Now, but it gets better. That's the starting point. He then comes down to explaining why it makes sense to make this assumption. So he says the hypothesis asserts three things. I'm just going to stick with number one. He says information is scarce. So if you're being a
Ah,
neoclassical economist, what's your next statement?
how much
Information
does
is scarce,
information
and
cost?
how much does it cost? And therefore, you're going to buy information up to the point at which the marginal
Yeah,
utility
that's right.
equals the marginal cost. Okay. He doesn't say that. What he says instead is information is scarce and the economic system generally does not waste it. In other words, he's assuming infinite consumption of a scarce,
Yes.
valuable resource. which is crazy. Even if you say it's non-rivalrous, which I'm sure a neoclassical is thinking that right now if they're listening to us. But
Yeah.
it basically says information, we assume it's free.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
even if it's
So,
non-rivalrous, it takes resources to validate, and because if it's
yeah.
free, then everyone's going to have the wrong information trying to trick you to, how many scams are
Well,
there out
the thing is, if it's free, you use infinite, you use everything that's
there?
available. Okay.
So,
That's what they assume you do, but
hmm,
it contradicts neoclassical theory. And
yeah,
this happens all the way through. And this to me comes down to something they're not even conscious of. And the same thing applies to Marxists. So I'm not being particularly necessarily critical just of neoclassicals.
hmm.
They've got an outcome. They believe, given how they've been conditioned by reading the theory, that capitalism is the best of all possible social systems. So they
Yeah,
therefore
yeah,
think we have to make the system look like what we know it can be, and we
yeah,
therefore are zealots. We're not academics, we're zealots trying to change the real world to fit the textbook. And then because their textbook has got obvious inconsistencies like this one, the whole idea of expectations, and future throws neoclassical theory for a curly. So here they say, let's get rid of it by
yeah,
assuming information is free. I'm sorry, that's contradicting your own bloody theory to hang on to the conclusion you wish to reach. And that's what I
yeah.
think that infects all versions of economics.
I think you're right. It's actually I've learned a lot. Maybe you can share your lessons about human nature, that people want to have those beliefs and outcomes, and once they pick the
Yeah.
one they like, they defend it, rather than
Mm.
saying, yeah, there's stuff I like in that. It's not perfect. Oh, that's a good critique, but what is yours better than that? Because we can trade off that, prices
Yeah.
work really well here, but then here, in the healthcare system, we worked it out half a century ago that just pricing everything's not as good socially as other allocations. So you can have that nuanced debate, but it's very hard to get, yeah, people to let go of their perfect ideal world and realize maybe the second best is worth having. Can I
Yeah. And
just
then,
ask you
yeah,
then
that's
about
realism
another
is so essential.
economist?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Um, Minsky, Hyman Minsky features in your work prominently, and in fact, I think informs your views about cycles and the buildup
Yep.
of debt. How did you come across Minsky's work, and how do you view it now? Do you take it all, or are you also critical of that? With there's some nuance here. These are
Yeah.
the bits I like, or have you expanded on it? What's the story
Yeah.
for our
I've
listeners of
came,
that?
I was like having rejected neoclassical economics, I did not become a Marxist instantly. A lot of people do that. They flip from neoclassical to Marxian or maybe Austrian or whatever else. I just sort of, I was fascinated by capitalism. How does it work? So my main interest is going to get realistic models of how the system functions. And obviously neoclassical economics didn't do that. That's why I led a student revolt at Sydney University over the fact we were only being taught neoclassical economics back in 1973. But at the same time, I was reading the critics, and I read Marx, and I thought Marx has got an obvious logical flaw. The labor theory of value contradicts his own philosophy. That was my first major academic work, which I wrote in my master's thesis. Got two academic publications out of that. Of course, Marxists haven't listened to me, but I rejected the Marxian explanation. The tendency for the rate of the profit to fall, which is what they say is going to lead to socialism, that was a fallacy. But equally the same thing. Marxists wanted to hang on to that fallacy, so they ignored logical contradictions in their argument.
Hmm.
I read Sparrow and Sweezy, and I'd read some Min. I read all these non-orthodox critiques, and all of them tended to have this argument, which comes out of the Marxist idea of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, of the argument capitalism heads towards stagnation. Now, that just didn't make sense to me. So anyway, was aware of Minsky, but I hadn't read him. And then in '87, and by this stage I'm 44, and I'm at university, 40, no, 34, pardon me. I'm at university and doing my master's degree, and then end up doing a PhD. And one of the essays was set by Bill Journal. You might even know Bill Journal. Lovely, progressive. He actually ran against Paul Keating
Oh
for
wow.
a Labor electorate, and unfortunately got screwed by Keating. Long story there. I think we'd been damn sight better off if we got Bill Journal rather than Paul Keating in Parliament, but that's a hypothetical history. Anyway, Bill gave us in the master's course we had to do one essay, and the essay was a book review, and one of the books was Hyman Minsky's John Maynard Keynes. And I'd heard the name, so I thought, well, I'll choose that. And then that's the first time I read Minsky. And for the first time, I found someone whose critique of capitalism to me made sense, because one of the punchlines in Minsky's argument was, and this is pretty much a quote, um, it follows, therefore, that the basic instability of capitalist economy is upwards. The tendency to turn doing well into a speculative investment boom is the fundamental instability in a capitalist economy. I thought, yes, that's what I've been
Mm,
seeing. Because like 73, when the student revolt was happening, that was the middle of a huge construction bubble. There was all sorts of parts of New Sydney in particular were being demolished for high rises, but it was a global phenomenon as well.
mm.
74, the whole thing came crashing down. So I saw a boom and bust in my own city, and that was what I thought you had to explain. And Minsky's was the first framework that I thought gave a sound explanation for it.
And so, can you maybe just, how do you summarize the financial stability hypothesis these days? Have you refined that
I could
explanation?
actually quote, if you like me to find a quote from Minsky that
Well, the
does it
most
well.
refined way that you explain it for our
Well, the
listeners.
most refined way is that capitalism is a cyclical system with finance, and in the cycles, people's expectations will change over the cycle. So they'll be more willing to borrow money during a boom than they're going to be willing to borrow money during a
Ah,
slump. So you get a cycle driven, first of all, by conflict over the distribution of income, workers wanting higher wages, capitalists trying to hang on to the profit. That itself gives you a cycle. But then what Minsky added in is that firms will borrow money during a boom to invest and have to repay it during a slump. And what that gives you is a dynamic that leads to a ratcheting up at the level of private debt over time until you reach such a level of private debt that you can't get out of the debt overwhelms the capacity of wages to fall to restore profits. So you end up in a debt deflation. And and that is the worry that Minsky was directing himself at. What causes the Great Depression? That was his most important question. So he put it brilliantly. Said the most uh, the most important the most important economic event of the post-war period is something that has not happened. There has not been
ah,
a deep and prolonged downturn for 35 years. He said to look at the history of capitalism, that is a remarkable success, because in the 19th century there was a serious crisis, bigger than the global financial crisis, every 10 to 15 years. Just
yeah.
regular events. It wasn't something that was once in a lifetime, it was once in a decade. So he said to go 35 years without an experience like that is a remarkable achievement. So there must be something in the post-war architecture that changed the dynamics of the economy to avoid this regular process. And then he said, can a Great Depression, happen again? And if it can happen, why hasn't it happened in the years between
Mm.
1945 and 1982 when he wrote that phrase? And he said, to answer this, you must have a system, a model of the economy that can generate a Great Depression. If your model can't do it, it's not a model of capitalism. So that's where I came in.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's that last line is great. The neoclassical view is, well, if there was a depression, we would know it in advance, and therefore we prices would be set today, so we'd avoid it,
And therefore we'd
and
avoid it. Yeah, yeah.
and then it could never happen. And so, I think I'm very much on board that that is the most interesting economic problem of capitalism. And I think for the
Yeah,
1800s, that was what most economists worried about. Why are there boom and bust cycles? And
yeah,
that was a huge deal. And we kind of forgot about that and said, oh, no, the nature of capitalism is we converge to the perfect point, and cycles are caused by exogenous shocks. You know, we
exactly. Yeah.
we suddenly decide to save too much and stop spending all at the same time. But maybe I can give the um, uh, not a maybe a neoclassical view, but a more naive economic view.
Yeah.
In classroom experiments, you can trade an asset that has a declining value over 20 or 50 rounds in a
Yeah.
computer game. And we know that that asset pays a certain amount per round, and that after 50 rounds, it pays nothing. So it should be worth zero. So
Yeah.
the fundamental value is declining, but you can trade that asset during the game, and people will bid up and create bubbles in a computer
Yeah.
experiment in 50 rounds without the need for debt, just because decision making is continuous. That, oh, if
Yeah.
they pay more, it's almost like gambling, right? Well, if they pay more, I should just momentum trade and get the upswing because as long as I'm not the last one out and so I'm one of the
Exactly.
first
Yeah.
ones, I can get it. So, is it consistent with this, or did Minsky required
Oh, look, that's
was
quite consistent with that. Yeah.
okay,
I mean, Minsky was a mathematician originally. He did an undergraduate degree in mathematics, and then he did a PhD in economics under Joseph Schumpeter and one of the more intelligent Austrians. I've forgotten his name, but another important sort of evolutionary thinker. And his parents were communists, but they were refugees from Russia because they were Menshevik communists, and the Bolsheviks were killing the Mensheviks. So his parents left to get away. So he was surrounded by Marxian logic, and his whole family, that's the orientation his family had. So he was quite outside the neoclassical mainstream. So when he went to do his PhD with Schumpeter, there's no way neoclassical thinking infected his mind.
hmm,
So he was free of all that stuff and then was trying to put into a sensible logical framework. And what he got with this, he took Fisher's argument. So Minsky, when he wrote his most important works, which were back in the 50s, which was his PhD, he hadn't even read Keynes. Okay. He'd read
right.
Irving Fisher. He hadn't read Keynes. So Irving Fisher was trying to explain how the Great Depression occurred, and Fisher's explanation began by saying, "Throw equilibrium out." This is again the thing the neoclassicals have no fucking idea of this. It just really pisses me off. Their ignorance is their major strength. Okay, so like there's a guy, I think his name, Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, absolutely beautiful name, a Spanish economist now, who's coming out. He's coming back and pushing all the equilibrium garbage after they've forgotten the global financial crisis occurred, and so they're back pushing their DSGE models again. He said at one point his equilibrium is absolutely essential for an economic theory, and the definition of equilibrium that we use was built by Irving Fisher in 1907. Okay, well, Irving Fisher realized in 1933 that his equilibrium beliefs are what bankrupted him. So if
Oh,
you
that's
read,
right.
if
So that's right.
okay,
Fisher went bankrupt gambling on the stock market or something, right?
yeah, yeah, because he was a fascinating character. I mean, if there's, I'd like to meet, all these various predecessors. I don't believe in God, so unfortunately, I don't expect to have it in heaven or hell. But it'd be great to get to have a chat with him because he was this firm believer in the neoclassical theory. He was also a tinkerer. He made stuff. So he made his money by inventing the Rolodex, for example. Did
All
you know
right.
that? Okay,
No.
so he made the first mechanical version of what we now call, iPod, iPhone, that sort of thing, and he sold it to a corporation that became the Rand Corporation, and then became a sit on the board and made a large amount of money that way. And then he also got involved. I don't know how much margin debt he got involved in, but margin speculation as well. And he was a columnist. So he wrote for the New York Times. And so he wrote all this stuff. And people who know Irving Fisher these days, because in the middle of the crash, he said, stocks have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau.
Oh,
I
that's right.
don't
Yeah.
think there will. I don't think there'll ever be a 50 or 60 point break, such as Mr. Babson is saying as a bear commentator. I expect to see the stock market a good deal higher than it is in the next few months. Well, it fell 90%. Okay? So over the next 3 years, he was completely wiped out. It just destroyed his reputation as well as it. So he was in shock. And then
Hmm.
he really, really, really went and examined what led me astray. And he finally concluded thinking equilibrium applies, led me astray.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
so that's so what he did anyway. That's usual. I'm being long-winded, but what he said was you start from a disequilibrium situation of too much debt and too low a level of inflation, and then he explained how starting in that situation, people would liquidate their stock to try to get money in to pay their own debts. Everybody liquidates, the price level falls. You reduce the level of debt you pay your nominal debt down, but the nominal GDP falls by more, so your debt ratio rises. And that did actually happen for the first 3 years of the Great Depression. People with debt level was falling and the debt ratio was rising. This was private debt.
Yeah.
So he explained, if you get to that situation, this is how you lead to a complete catastrophe. What Minsky tried to do is how do you get to that position in the first place? Okay.
Ah.
So he said he said that the natural starting point for analyzing the relationship between debt, even private debt, and income is to take an economy which has had a financial crisis in the recent past, but is now doing moderately well. So because there's been a recent crisis, people are conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on, and that's both the borrower and the
And the
banks are
lender. Yeah.
conservative. So only conservative projects are put forward. Because only conservative projects are put forward for funding, and because the economy has largely recovered from the last slump, those projects succeed. So people look at it and think, oh, if we'd borrowed more money, we would have made a larger profit. We would have
Uh,
been more levered. So people start revising up the level of debt they're willing to take on relative to equity. And then as they do that, of course, there's more investment. So the economy goes into a boom, and uh, you get rising wages coming out of that and rising energy costs because as the demand rises, workers can get wage rises, raw material suppliers can put prices up, and so on. So the distribution of income changes because of the boom. And then you get to the peak of the boom, and capitalists aren't making the profits they expected. Wages have risen and taken a chunk out of profits. Energy costs the same thing. You then have less profit. Capitalists stop investing. The rate of
mm,
economic growth declines, and you go into another cycle.
yeah.
So Fisher explained a point and how you go from the point. Minsky explained how you start at a particular point of the cycle in historical time and then get back to the same point at a later stage. And I thought this is brilliant, but his attempted model mathematically failed. And so
Ah.
I said, okay, that's my PhD topic. I'll take that on.
Oh, that's well, I want to move on to that and also the financial crisis because that's sort of the
Hmm.
most recent experience for most of us, even though Australia sort of escaped it. But I need to pick up um, on one point using the term equilibrium and saying, oh, equilibrium's a problem. This word has lots of different interpretations and meanings in
Yeah.
economics. There's one of like, there's a price equilibrium, like all future prices are packaged in today, and we get something and it's the right one. There is the
Hmm.
trading equilibrium, which is just buyers and sellers when they're mutual benefit, they just trade until there's no buyers left. Like, if there's a cyclone and there's not enough bananas,
Mm.
price goes up, fewer buyers, we get to equilibrium. I just want to say that because my book about housing talks about equilibrium a lot, whether it's the
Yeah.
rental market and the trading off between these two things at a micro level. But I guess what you're trying to say is this macroeconomic long-term equilibrium is a flat line or a smooth exponential
Well,
curve
it's
rather than a boom and bust cycle, which might also be in an equilibrium at any point in time. I'm just trying to be
the
clear on the
equal.
word so I don't.
Yeah, I mean the word. I want to throw the word out of bloody
Okay.
economics.
Okay.
Okay, equilibrium, and savings are two words I'd abolish from economics
Ooh.
if I
What
could
about
control it.
capital? That's a
Well,
tricky one too.
capital's necessary, and I've actually worked out how you can actually justify scalar models of
Okay.
capital-based energy as well. But yeah, savings is individuals save, systems don't. Okay,
Hmm.
you can't we can't increase the amount of money in existence by saving more money. Okay, this is the classic paradox of thrift. If everybody decides to save money, what they mean is they spend more slowly. And if they spend more slowly, they don't change the total amount of money in existence, but the money turns over more slowly, so you get a lower GDP coming out
Yeah.
of it. So, it's misleading. Savings is a misleading concept at the macro level. But back to equilibrium, the
Yeah.
form of equilibrium that Jesus Valverde is putting forward, which Fisher first said, is it's equilibrium is where everybody's actions are such that nobody feels inclined to change what they're currently doing. So that's self-consist. That's systemic consistent expectations. That's
Hmm.
what they mean by equilibrium. That's bullshit. I mean,
Ah.
there's never a point where that applies in the real world because your behavior depends upon what you focus upon. And so I know, like as a middle class person, I know what's happening in the academic labor market. I have no idea of what's happening in the steel market, etc., etc. So we have different expectations from different roles, social roles. They're not self-consistent. The whole belief that they can be is a delusion. Again, another neoclassical delusion. So their concept of equilibrium is just the wrong sort of concept. And equally, the fact that they think you have to have equilibrium to do modeling in the first place shows they haven't escaped the 19th century because it's been possible for at least 80 years to do mathematics of systems which are changing through time You
Mm.
can probably define an equilibrium for them, but what you do is you simply state the dynamic processes and see
Yeah.
how they model together. Equilibrium is a side effect, and there's no way you believe the system converges to equilibrium.
Mm. I guess, yeah. At any point in time in that system, it's in equilibrium. Like the moon
No,
orbits
no.
the
At any
Earth, and
point,
it's in the
any point
equilibrium.
in time, it's moving. Okay, it's
Oh
not
yeah,
an
yeah, yeah.
equilibrium.
Oh, I
Yeah,
mean, yeah,
this is so easy to fall into that way of thinking.
yeah,
People say, oh, it's got to be an equilibrium. No, it's a process of change. It's changing at a set rate at the moment, but there's no way it's an equilibrium. So to me, it's a poison, intellectual poison to think in terms of equilibrium. Science has long ago escaped it. They'll use equilibrium in the specific instances where it applies. So if you're trying to do, if you're one part of the statistical thermodynamics is how do you work out the pressure of air in a room? And you can take the average at a point in time in the room, because the system, even though all the molecules are bouncing off each other in
mm,
a crazy, dynamic bounce, that's what we feel as pressure. Uh, it's that particular point in time is not different to another period of point in time. As the atoms move around, the pressure is constant, in the room. uh, I'm explaining this rather badly because I'm not somebody who specializes in
yeah.
thermodynamical equilibrium. But the basic idea is it makes it easy to take the average at a point in time and say that
Mm.
can also predict the behavior of the system through time. It's what's known as an
Ah, yeah.
ergodic system. Okay, so that's the definition of equilibrium where it makes sense to use equilibrium to be able to actually derive results which are applied through time. But the vast majority of systems are what are called non-ergodic. They don't reach equilibrium at any point. And if you want to model those, you've got to look at the change over time. And then if you do it, equilibrium is something you might use at some stage to talk about the mathematical characteristics of the system. But you'd never imagine that the system is in equilibrium. It simply
Yeah.
doesn't end up there.
As in an
You stay far
unmoving
from
final
equilibrium.
point. Is that what, it's never gets
Sorry?
to that. It never gets to an unmoving final point.
Yeah,
Is what you're trying.
it's far from equilibrium. It's bound, and that's the beauty of the work that was done by,
Mm.
well, the meteorologist sorry, Edward Lorenz back in 1963, when he discovered what we now call the butterfly effect, and that is when you have a complex system, nonlinear dynamics as part of it, you will get the equilibrium can all be unstable. Okay,
That's right.
so therefore you're
Yeah.
never in equilibrium, and that's become commonplace for mathematical disciplines apart from economics to model that way. Economists still think it's all in bloody equilibrium.
So I want to get to a few more topics. I don't housing, the financial crisis, your
Mm.
policy thoughts, public debt, and what you see happening in the future. So can we fast forward
Yeah.
to pre-financial crisis in Australia? You were calling that there's a big debt buildup. We're in a speculative bubble. Things will correct. Was this? I guess. Do you, looking back now in 2026, what do you think you got right and wrong from that period?
Well, I got the cause completely right. Okay? And the cause was, and this again, you can only get this even on neoclassical, credit is part of aggregate demand and income. So the
Mm,
change in private debt adds to aggregate demand and aggregate income. And I've proven that logically since then. Once you realize money supply is endogenous, created by banks, then you get the result that credit turns up as part of both aggregate demand and income, and also the purchasing of assets. So I got that right. The change in the driving what was boosting demand dramatically in the period 2000 to 2007 was rising private debt, and rising private debt meant credit, which was the change in debt, was
mm,
positive, and credit in the American case reached 15% of GDP, which is the
yeah.
highest it had been in the post-war period, I think ever too. And then it fell to -5. So I was looking at the level of private debt. I saw this exponential increase in the ratio of private debt to GDP in both Australia and America, the only two countries I could get data for at the time. I said, this can't continue. When the rate of growth of debt starts to slow down, it'll probably go negative. When it goes negative, we'll have a serious recession. So that's what I was saying, and that's what happened. Of course, there's an exception, which is called Australia.
Yeah.
Might get, and I want to get the record right. This one really
Yeah.
pisses me off. Okay. So, um, what actually, if you look at what was happening globally, in which countries were the people who became prominent in the news services warning about a crisis? The answer is myself in Australia, Nouriel Roubini in America, Dean Baker as well, Fred Harrison in the UK, there's about and Michael Hudson as well,
That's right.
about a dozen people, okay? And like in terms of prominence, I became the most prominent of any of them in their own national media. So I'm pretty certain Nouriel, I've met Nouriel over the years. I'm pretty certain he got on the New York Times. He probably got on, CNBC and stuff like that. I got interviewed on the 7:30 report by Kerry O'Brien, okay, for half the show. Okay, and this is back in 2008, and um, in the interview, I was asked, I think for the first time, about what's going to happen to house prices. And so I think I said in that, well, Japan's house prices fell by 40% when its bubble economy burst back in 1990, like over the next 15
Mm.
years. And I see no reason why Australia will avoid the same fate. So that was my first time really mentioning house prices. I was mainly focusing upon, I wasn't giving a shit about house prices. I was giving a shit about unemployed people
Mm.
coming forward. So I wasn't focusing on house prices so much. If you read my Debt Watch reports, which I put out from December of 2005 forward, I don't think I mentioned house prices. I really can't remember. Probably I did, but it certainly wasn't a major focus. Anyway, that was me on one day. The day after, Kerry O'Brien interviews Kevin Rudd for the entire show, of course. Okay? And he savages them. You can actually find this on the ABC transcript. Savages them about my views, like Keynes' warnings about this, etc., etc. And he really had. I found the text. I can't find the video. You can find the video of me being interviewed by Kerry, but I can't find the video of Kerry
Mm-hmm.
arguing with Rudd the very next day. But I remember seeing the interview, of course, and Rudd was flummoxed. He was sort of almost, being slightly catatonic, and he's doing a Joe Cocker in the chair to some extent. But then the next 6 days later, the Rudd government announced the first home owners boost.
Mm.
Okay, first home buyers boost. And I called it the first home vendors boost. They doubled and trebled the amount of money they gave to buy a home. So you went from $7,000 to 14 for buying an existing home and 21,000 for buying a new home. And then in Victoria, the Victorian government, also Labor, bumped it up by another $14,000 if you bought outside in a metropolitan ring, meaning you got $35,000 from the government to go buy a house.
And
Well,
what
guess
were
what?
houses worth in regional Victoria then? Probably a
Oh,
few hundred
that
thousand,
would have
right? So you're getting
been,
10%
well, more like
of,
150,000,
oh, so,
200,000. Okay, it
so
was
ten
certainly
to
more than
20%
10%
of the price you're getting as a subsidy.
given to you by the government. Go get a housing loan. What did they do? They went and got a housing loan. So if you take a look at the data, what happened was in America, without anybody, Renewaria wasn't as effective as me at warning on this particular issue. So the American government sailed straight into it, and then the huge crash hit, and they didn't have any reverse policies coming out of the government at all. It wasn't until the Federal Reserve started doing QE that you got any real policies to go in the opposite direction. Whereas Australia threw everything to try to keep the level of demand up, and what they did was they stopped credit going negative in Australia. And I can actually show this. Would it be useful looking at the data to make that comparison? Would that help?
Uh, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying.
I'll
Uh,
show the part. I'm gonna,
bring it
if you
up
can,
while
yeah,
I sort of contextualize all this.
yeah. You chat and I'll bring it up. Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, for those who weren't around in the financial crisis, the amount of first home buying stimulus makes what we're doing today look pretty embarrassingly small. We've got, not sure if you're aware, Steve, because you haven't probably been following Australian housing too much, but we have this
Mm.
5% deposit scheme where the
Oh, I
government
was
will pay the
disgusted
mortgage
by that.
lending
I was
and you can get a high loan to value
disgusted by it.
ratio. But
Yeah.
if you compare that to, if we're comparing the relative scale of the subsidy to first home buyers,
Mm.
$30,000 in 2009 for
It's
when
huge.
prices were three or $400,000
or
versus
less.
that,
Yeah,
that would be like getting 60 plus $1,000 today to buy a house as a first
yeah,
home
at
buyer.
least. Yeah,
And that's the sort of order of magnitude for those around today thinking about housing, of how concerned the government was about prices falling. And for a little bit of political context, remember, we are also pretending, governments are also pretending right now that they want prices to be lower, right? Oh, wish
yeah.
Price
Ha
House
ha
could go
ha.
better. Then when they do it, and our last experience of this, well, they probably throw 50 or 60 grand at every new home buyer to prevent that happening. Now,
Yeah,
hey, does it boost first home buying? Yeah, it does. Does it prevent the sort of deflation of this and realign expectations? Yeah, probably prevents that too. But
yeah.
that's some
So that
context.
that so that's the context. And if I can just share my screen now,
You
so we
should be
can do
able to,
that.
I think, Steve.
Yep, I just it's fine. Got it
Yep.
working here. So this is Bank of International Settlement data on debt levels around the world, and this is America. So we all know America had a boom and bust. So and the crazy thing is house prices are now bigger than they were back at the crisis. But
So
the
we're looking at
crisis
the
is
black
here.
line of debt there.
The red line is house prices and the black
Uh-huh.
line is debt. Okay, so you get this
Yeah.
household debt, which is
Mm-hmm.
measured over here, and this is the house price index on the right hand side.
Mm.
And this rising level of debt, that's what I said was going to cause the crisis. Now, my argument is about house prices is that what determines the demand for housing is fundamentally new mortgage debt.
Mm.
Okay? So because most houses are bought with borrowed money, the monetary demand comes from a change in debt. And that therefore gives you a relationship between the change in mortgage debt, which is I call credit,
Yeah.
and the level of house prices. So you then get a relationship between the change in debt and change in house prices. And when you put that through for America, that's what I'm doing here. In the
On the right.
bottom chart here,
Oh, yeah.
you can see this huge plunge down here. So credit goes massively negative, and you end up with a recession. And the correlation coefficient is sitting there. That's the American data. So the correlation between the change in debt, so it's a second differencing, and the change in house prices is 0.63 over the last 50 years. Okay,
So,
now that's
yeah.
America. Okay, let's
Okay.
look at Australia. Okay, so I'll drag my selector along to Australia here. Hang on. Whoa. Okay, recalculate. And you'd think that Australia didn't have a crisis. Australian house prices still rising. Australian houses must behave
Well,
differently.
not
Notice that
everywhere. I think people forget that after
I'll
the
come back to that in a
financial
sec.
crisis, the
Yeah,
region, I'm in Brisbane, prices went nowhere for 10 years in nominal
yeah,
terms. So there was quite interesting there was like 25% real correction
yeah. But
in
here's
inflation adjusted terms.
yeah, but nonetheless, but house
Look at that.
prices have continued rising in Australia, okay? And that's quite very different pattern for household debt and household prices. But you look at the correlation between the acceleration in
Mm.
mortgage debt and the change in house prices, it's higher for Australia, okay?
Do you,
So the causal factors are the same in both countries. What differed is how much the government dives in to try to keep house prices up.
so
Because
I
what they
guess,
do every time they bring in a scheme is they try to cause the level of mortgage debt to accelerate again, which keeps the house price bubble going. And they've been very successful at doing that, unfortunately.
I guess the most logical critique, having looked at that, Steve, is that the prices in the US, the debt levels have not been rising recently, and prices have. And so that would be one question. Is the level
Well,
irrelevant,
that's because it's
really?
acceleration driven. That's it.
So it's actually
That fits the data.
okay. So the level
Okay.
that's do you not think the build up in the level during one of those periods of acceleration matters? So, for example, um, pre-GFC, there's a lot of housing turnover and a lot of mortgage debt, and as you can
Yeah.
see from
Hmm.
that balance of debt. But
Yeah.
since COVID, there's been less turnover. Prices have risen on smaller sort of turnover, and therefore, yes, the acceleration of debts happened, but not quite it hasn't changed the balance as much. Do you think then this period
It's
is
still the
less
same
risk?
causal factor.
Okay,
This is like again. I'll go back and share my screen again for the American data because that's
yeah.
nobody argues there wasn't a bubble in America. And so okay,
That's
what
true.
you see there, you got this. rising debt and rising house prices. Then you've got
Yeah.
rising debt and falling house prices, and now you've got falling debt and rising house prices. Okay,
Yeah.
so if you just look at the raw data, you can't make head nor tail of it. When you
Correct.
take the logical argument I'm going and saying the monetary demand from housing comes from new mortgages, so the new mortgages are related to the level of house prices.
Ah, I
Therefore,
see.
the change in new mortgages is related to the change in house prices. And did you get debt acceleration and house price change? That's the driving factor.
So
And that
people can
applies
pay
in
off their
every
mortgage
country.
balances, and that will bring the
Yeah,
stock down while new mortgages are being issued.
that's
And that
right.
rate, okay.
Okay. So it's ridiculous how well that correlation works.
So,
And imagine getting a 0.63 correlation coefficient for your
yeah.
econometric model. You're pretty happy. This is just out of raw bloody data.
So
So it just shows how strong the influence is.
the other obvious critique would be, well, of course, debt acceleration correlates with price change because they're both caused by a third factor, which is people wanting to buy housing assets and not others. And when you do, because you can leverage into it, there is an amount of leverage that optimizes your risk adjusted return. So they're just both correlated because they both run on that same
Yeah,
speculative
yeah, but
thing that
you
happens
can
in computer
it,
experiments
it,
and things like that.
what it says is you've got to have the bank system creating the money. And this is where, again, neoclassical economics is a waste of space because they
Right.
try to tell students that banks don't create money. Okay, see, if you look at the neoclassical model, which is loanable funds, it tells you that banks are mere intermediaries who enable savers to lend to borrowers. Okay,
Well, we
there's
better
no
dive
change in the
into
amount of
this.
another myth, complete
Yeah.
absolute bloody myth, and they continue pushing it forward because they want to have a model in which money doesn't matter. So that's why they don't even look at this stuff because they've got a model that tells them money is unimportant in capitalism.
Yeah. So I think
As well, like saying wings are unimportant on birds.
I think it's funny because when you learn neoclassical economics or mainstream or whatever we're calling it,
Yeah,
you got to understand that they're abstracting away from money. Everything's inflation adjusted. It's all real prices relative to
so
others.
called. Yeah,
They call it the numeraire. It's not a dollar. It's just a relativity that equals one of two prices in the economy, and every price is measured relative to it. And so when they say money doesn't matter, it's because we're sort of assuming we've looked through the
the
money
veil of money.
and
Yeah,
and all the prices have adjusted because of the change in the money, and we all know that already, and therefore we can trade and we get this trading equilibrium. But I think where you've changed my view a lot, Steve, back in the debunking economics early 2000s day
mhm.
was more that actually in the aggregate it really matters because
Absolutely,
the
it's
money
critical. Yeah,
circulates, but it also gets injected as well continuously. There's a flow into the system,
of new money being created. Yeah,
which you actually need in for capitalism, right?
yeah.
So and this
Capitalism
is
needs a growing money supply. Yeah,
and a lot of people hate me when they go, oh, we should have Bitcoin. It's all about money devaluation. I'm like, we need the money supply to expand as the economy grows. We need it. We can't just fix it like your Bitcoin thing. They hate it,
yeah,
but it's true, right? Like, I don't
yeah.
know.
It,
How do you make this
it,
argument to the skeptics?
Well, I just basically say, let's look at data. I mean, this again, the Austrian obsession with avoiding data and saying you can look inside yourself and work out everything in the economy, what they call praxeology. I just realized we shouldn't call it praxeology. We should call it practology. It's going up their asses. Uh, but Anyway, you look at the data and you go back and take a look at the data and find the booms and busts of America for the last 200 years have been driven by credit booms and busts. In fact, like I even found a crisis that I didn't know it existed by looking at the credit data. So, as well as using the Bank of International Settlements now to do data post-war, the BIS makes my life so much easier because they
Mhm.
collect all the data from all the central banks. And I had to struggle like crazy to put together data from the RBA and the Federal Reserve flow of funds when I first did those warnings back in 2005 and six and seven. But these days, the BIS does the work for me. But of course, they don't have data going back to the 1800s. So I found data from the United States Census and a range of different data series. And I managed to get private debt back to 1817 and government debt back to 1790. And then I plotted the rate of change of private debt, which is
Hmm.
credit, of course, and that's one of my main fixations, credit as a percentage of GDP. And I saw this huge negative in 1837. I went, oh, wonder what happened then. So I go searching the history, and there's a thing called the Panic of
Oh, wow.
1837. Huge decline, and it was actually it is said to be such a large crisis that it wiped out the memory of all previous crises. We've forgotten about it because it's 1.5 going on 2 centuries ago. Okay, I located it by using my analysis of what causes depressions. I found the negative. That was the biggest depression before the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So
So it's
the
funny that you
data
say
tells
that.
you money
Yeah.
matters. Sorry.
It's funny you say that because I think the 1890s depression was called the Great Depression until the 1930s one
Yeah.
superseded it, and that got called the Great Depression. So
That's right.
probably
And
that
Australia,
happens.
like Australia, had a worse one in 1890. The one really good paper by the RBA is by Fisher and Kent, and it's called Two Banking Crises and One Depression. I think that's the title of the paper.
Uh-huh.
And they compared the 1890s to the 1930s for Australia and said that the 1890s were worse for Australia than the Great Depression was. America was different. The Great Depression was a bigger drop than what happened in the 1890s for them. But yeah, every 10 to 15 years, there was a crisis caused by the financial sector. And you have a bunch of economists saying the financial sector doesn't matter. They're a bunch of fairies. It's
So,
all irrelevant stuff, and they're distracting us from the real world.
so we should then bring it to the current day, and get towards wrapping things up. And the
Okay.
current day involves post-COVID global housing boom. Bit of
Mm,
a correction in some places. New Zealand for the last few years, Canada is seeing things correct. Do you
yeah.
see that happening now globally, one of these cycles and corrections,
I'm
or?
I'm following that data less than I used to. I still look at it, obviously, but my main focus these days is what's going to happen with climate change.
Uh-huh.
And if you have any climate change deniers, they're going to turn off now, and I don't care. Because neoclassical economists, if you think they stuffed us up over the global financial crisis by not even seeing what was causing it, and therefore saying the future is looking really rosy, and we
Uh-huh.
smashed into a global financial crisis, it was obvious if you look at the data. They're even worse with global warming. So the reason people think like GDP might fall by
Hmm.
10% in 2100 is because they've swallowed bullshit by economists. The same numbers that economists say is going to cause GDP to be 10% lower in the far distant future than it would have been without global warming. Those same temperature levels, scientists tell us that they're going to drive us extinct. And we're going to bump into the gap between economic theory and reality in climate in the next decade. And that's
So
what really concerns me.
you're saying this is more than just a sort of boom and bust cycle in the climate.
This is
So,
existential.
okay.
This is existential.
What I want to do is, because most of my listeners are housing people, you've put
Okay, well,
in.
I'll have a bit of a chat about housing. You know, I rank the extinction of the human race slightly ahead of the house prices falling.
In Australia, Steve, come on, it's Australia. Have you been to a barbecue recently? Um,
Thank Christ I managed to avoid them for the last dozen years.
so
Yeah, I know.
you've got a couple of policy ideas that you've called pill and aha that I've seen you
Mhm.
talk about. I just want to, like, we've both thought about, stabilizing the cycle and,
Yeah,
the human cost of the cycle, I guess. And I always tell people it's not a crisis, it's a cycle. And if we don't like it, we've got to understand the market before we think we're trying to fix it. So
yeah.
that's sort of my approach. What do you think we could modify to dampen the cycle in
Well, the main
housing?
thing is house prices are driven by change by levels of mortgage debt. The increasing mortgages doesn't create more houses. Okay, it drives up the prices of existing houses far more than it creates new houses. So letting banks lend as much as they want to lend, let alone as much as they're encouraged to lend by a government that's underwriting their behaviour, is wrong. You should limit the amount of money that can be lent against a house. So I've got a set of ideas to limit how much debt can
Uh-huh.
be issued. Like my father was a bank manager and fairly prominent in the Commonwealth Bank. And if you went to go as my father, you had to, wear your suit, husband and wife go along together, get inside the room, show you're responsible. Dad might give you a bank loan, but you had to have a 30% deposit. Okay. Well, now look at this crap that bloody Albanese is doing. 5% deposit. That's really the change. We've gone from allowing a 3-to-1 gearing ratio for housing to a
Hmm.
20-to-1 gearing ratio for housing. Now, ultimately, it gets to the point where we've driven house prices up so much that the next generation can't even manage to take on the debt to take your place and drive the house price up even further. And I think that's where we're teetering right now because, what are we going to allow? 50-to-1, 2% deposits?
Well,
We're actually as levered as we can possibly be. So I think we've pretty much reached the terminal stage of that particular bubble.
do you think that though, if we're using monetary policy to manage the economy and we're got sort of structural, what we call the structural decline, interest rates we pay on a mortgage have, on average, been falling for 40 years, that we
Mm.
kind of have to see house prices rise because, if you can borrow
But
more a 2% mortgage, then the price can't sort of be a 5% yield because
exactly.
then
If
there's
you if
free
you let
money.
banks put that level of leverage, yes, house prices are going to rise. Is that
But
good for the society? No, it's not.
But
Okay.
even people
So
who aren't borrowing would take their $1 million, right? That they're only getting 2% on at the bank and then go get
mm,
5% buying a house. And it's just would keep the
yeah,
prices up, wouldn't
it sucks. We get sucked into asset price bubbles, and this to me is destructive. Capitalism isn't about building price bubbles; it's about building goods and services and commodities and
it?
factories. And we're
So,
undermining the nature of capitalism to let focus upon asset markets rather than upon real production.
yeah, I think that's that's definitely a distraction people get. They want us to look after the markets, as in the financial markets, not the
Yeah.
businesses, the markets of production, the businesses that produce and trade. I think that's an important distinction. But one thing I've always wanted to ask you, Steve, is your view on
Mm.
using monetary policy to try and stabilize the cycle. This seems to be the consensus for since the start of the 1990s, globally. Some people would say it's working quite well.
Would
We
they?
use fiscal
Can I
policy.
get some of the drugs they've got? Mine are
Inflation's
boring by comparison.
well, I mean, inflation's been much more stable since then than the 40 years since than the 40 years before. Um, yeah, well, I
You know,
mean,
the
what's your
economic,
take on using monetary policy as the primary
it's
stabilization tool?
garbage. It's
Oh, okay.
garbage. Okay, okay.
Why?
Only because neoclassicals have convinced themselves that fiscal policy doesn't matter. One of the other
Oh,
pieces of garbage you can find in literature is called the PIP, the Policy Ineffectiveness Proposition. And they argue, again, because of rational expectations,
yeah,
we all have infinite information. We can all predict the future. We all know the government has to have a net, the government spending must sum to zero in the long run. Therefore, we know if the government runs a
deficit now.
stimulatory tries
Yeah.
to stimulate now by running a deficit. We know they've got to tax us in the future, so we put aside money to pay future taxes.
Is
That's the
that called
bullshit that they
Ricardian
come up with.
equivalence or something, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean all
okay.
that. I mean Ricardo, the extent to which they try to dress themselves up, reading by naming ancient economists they haven't read, and not knowing what those economists actually think. I think it's quite hilarious. But yeah, they call it Ricardian equivalence,
So
and
I think a lot of
it's a
economists
myth.
do, though, like think fiscal policy works. And in fact, many are saying now that Australia's persistent high inflation relative to other countries is because governments are spending too much. Like, I don't think it's, I mean, maybe not as
It's
dominant
it's still the
as
religion. Okay, the dominant religion says fiscal policy is ineffective. That's why they shift over to monetary policy, because the neoclassicals have always been against government deficits. So to
uh,
say they're ineffective is even more powerful,
uh,
you know. And then they
I,
say you can't control it using the deficit, so you can only control it by changing people's behavior, by changing the interest rates, which they take into account when they go shopping. So of course you know that when you go shopping you're making a decision about the utility of your dynasty over the next 5,000 years. You're aware you're doing that, aren't you? Okay. Okay. Hey, I've got to load this one. This is the sort of shit these idiots come up with that
well, I'll
it's
try
one
and
reason.
I'll play devil's advocate a bit and give the
Yeah.
generous view is that it doesn't need to affect consumer spending because investment spending is part of the economy and investment spending in buying new houses, borrowing to renovate, buy a new car or boat, expansion, whatever, that is also sensitive to the interest rate. And that is still spending, right? When I renovate the house or buy a new, order a new
Oh,
house from a
interest rates
builder.
affect the
So
economy. Interest rates affect the economy, but not the way the neoclassicals argue they do.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so they have everything you've said there is realistic, and therefore it's not part of economic theory.
Okay.
Okay, um, okay. So what they argue, if you've read the original papers by Barrow and people like that that gave us this idea of Ricardian equivalence and the argument, they have what they call the Euler equation. You've heard of that one, I presume,
Yeah. That's
in
Euler,
DSG models.
EULER.
LER, a great
Yeah.
mathematician insulted by economists by attaching his name to a bullshit proposition. But the so-called Euler equation relates consumption to the rate of interest over time. So the variable,
Oh,
the volatile variable in DSG models isn't investment, it's
it's
consumption.
yeah, yeah. No,
Okay, now
I
that's
mean,
crap. That's crap.
yeah,
Okay,
that is
yeah.
crap.
The real world, you were right. You're saying, you see, they leave out debt. Okay, so one
Yeah,
reason that interest rates work is because it increases the debt repayment burden of households. They've got less
correct.
disposable money to buy goods and services, so it does have
Oh,
an impact that way. But it's completely different to the models they use to supposedly manage the economy.
although what's funny is that is you see a lot of research just coming out contradicting this sort of 101 textbook legacy stuff.
Yep.
Like even the Reserve Bank goes, "Oh, how do the what do they call it? The transmission channels." That's the jargon for how does monetary policy work. And they do
Yeah.
things like survey households when their interest rate falls to see if they refinance to have a lower repayment. And almost no one does, right? So
Mm,
interest rates fall, it doesn't change consumption of existing mortgage holders because they just repay the mortgage faster, but the same
mm,
payment per month. And then I think in the opposite way, and a lot of people keep a buffer anyway. So in the opposite way, it doesn't change consumption
yep.
much. And so they go, well, it's not really the consumption channel. There's the foreign exchange channel. Well, that's sort of anticipated, and there's long run factors, and there's you know uh, other effects rather than the interest rate. And then they go, oh yeah, it's just predominantly people buying new houses and renovating. Like they sort of eliminate all those dominant factors that
Mm.
are sort of amplified,
The,
as you say, in the textbook. And then so the practitioners end up having to reject a lot of that to actually practice
yeah.
economics.
It's
It's
just
weird.
it's nonsense, and that's one reason I'm trying to reform it. And that's my book, The New Economics, and Manifesto, is about how it's possible to do economics in a completely different way. But
So
again, it's
yeah.
the extent to which like a religious obsession has hit neoclassical economists, and that's what drives healthy development theory, not reaction to what happens in the real world.
So you better tell everyone about your new book. We've been going for quite a while here, so we should
Yeah,
wrap up.
okay.
What is it? Is it coming out? Have you got a date?
Oh, there's one called The New Economics and Manifesto that's already out. That's been about for 2 or 3 years. I'm actually over in London, so I can meet the Japanese translators. It's coming out in
All right.
Japanese
I
later
better
this
put a
year.
link to that one. I
Uh,
haven't read it. Oh no.
haven't you? Okay,
I only read your old books,
it's
Steve. The classics.
okay. The New Economics and Manifesto. I wrote that in 2022, I think.
Ah,
Published in 2022. Now one I'm working on now is called How Economists Will Destroy Capitalism.
okay. Okay. Give us the
That goes
teaser for that. Why would
well,
econ
because they believe capitalism can cope with anything and therefore climate change can't be a problem.
okay.
Okay,
So
that's their
just
thinking.
the true belief that the price will fix it, we'll work out the right
Yep,
price now, troubles will
yep.
be
Work out the
solved.
right price, and we'll work out
Well,
the price at which Antarctica doesn't melt.
okay.
And when you read their work, I mean, I've read some garbage in neoclassical theory. Nothing prepared me for how bad Nordhaus's work was, and they gave
Yeah.
the idiot the Nobel Prize.
Well,
All the work that neoclassical economists done on climate change, I don't believe they should have got a Nobel Prize. I think he should have got a Nuremberg Prize.
well, I'm gonna have to read it, I think, Steve. So,
Yeah,
um, look, is there any final concerns? I know you've been talking about the US empire and
yeah,
like one of the things on your recent videos is everyone's scared of public debt.
yeah.
Um,
That's
should
completely
we be
wrong.
scared of debt?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Scared
Why
of
shouldn't we
private debt
be?
because government creates money. It doesn't borrow. And you've got to do the accounting to see this, and that's why I invented Ravel as a software package that lets you do integrated accounting views of an economy. But the government, when you take a look at it, government does not borrow. Okay, it creates money by going into negative equity for itself. The
Hmm.
borrowing is an after effect of laws that require government not to run an overdraft at the central bank. That's what bond sales do. so the government doesn't have to borrow. And if you people are worried about the level of government debt, I have a simple solution. Make me Reserve Bank governor, and the next day I'll buy all outstanding bonds.
Yeah. So I
Okay,
mean,
I could do it.
apparently,
I could do it. Bang, no more debt. Okay, do it tomorrow. What's the problem, kids? It's this obsession with treating governments as being just like households. If they
yeah.
get into too much debt, they can go bankrupt. Government, the households don't have a bank that can buy all their debt and then stop them having to pay
Mm.
interest. The government does.
So what's the limiting factor then, Steve, on
Limiting
government
factor
spending?
is private debt. The limiting factor is private debt. That's what we should be focusing upon. And
So
in
I've
fact, try ignoring private debt while focusing on government debt is one reason why government debt has risen.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think people miss the point that, of course, private debt expands the money in the economy, and we need that for
Yep.
capitalism, and public debt does too. But the system is closed, right? We don't owe the Martians or the aliens money. We owe each other money. And that
Yeah.
public debt sits in your superannuation account as a treasury bond. It's also an
Earning
asset
your
to
money.
someone and it's a
Yeah.
liability, right? So it's going to end up
Yeah.
transferring in the future an interest payment from the tax pool to the bondholders,
Yeah.
nothing more and nothing less.
Yeah.
And if the
It's
central bank
completely wrong
owns
to
it,
obsess about that. Yeah.
yeah, as it does in
It,
Japan, owns more than half the national debt, right? So it's the treasury paying the central bank its interest on its debt, and the central bank lending money back to the treasury.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's a it's bizarre. Look, Steve, I've taken a lot of your time. I know you're traveling. I really appreciate it. I'll send people to your new book. Uh,
Hmm.
and is your YouTube channel the best place to find
Yeah, the
what's
YouTube
on your
channel's
mind
pretty
these?
good. The YouTube channel at Prof. Steve Keen on YouTube. That's probably the best place to find my arguments easily. And they promote a course that I'm giving, an online course, which
Mhm.
has got marketing that makes me cringe. Okay, but it does lead to my courses, and and that's I've got over 1,000 people who've enrolled in those courses now. So
Wow.
you know, bite your tongue, go through the marketing hoops. It really is a whole bunch of, funnels, all the sort of stuff
Yeah.
marketing people talk about, but it does lead to my course. And there are two courses I'm giving, a short one and a long one. And that's, if you really want to get to know how I think about economics, that's the best thing to do. But the YouTube channel, and also I've got Patreon and Substack.
I'll bring all those links together. Steve, I really appreciate your time. For the listeners, I think Steve influenced a lot of Australian economists thinking through the financial crisis and before on lots of different topics. And, I think all Australian economists think more broadly now than we did before. So thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. Not
I
all of
wouldn't
us,
quite say
some of
that, but
us.
some of them do.
Me and all my cool friends, my cool
You
economist
do,
friends,
definitely,
we try
definitely.
and keep an open mind, and I'm trying to build on your legacy, Steve. Try and keep an open mind. So I really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Indeed. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks for the invite.